time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the Heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, it's kind of one of those winter days. It's dim, it's gloomy, and that's the way it is in the Heartland. I had to pick out my shirt again this morning. Everybody knows, watches the show, I've got all these shirts in different colors. I picked black today, folks, because we are in mourning. Anybody that follows the news knows that there's been another murderous rampage, shooting rampage in a school, and it's here in the Heartland. I hope you saw the graphic. Horror in the Heartland. Why won't someone do something? And of course, that actually was not going to be the topic of today's show. We're going to start there, and then we're going to transition to what I had originally intended to talk about, which is the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal underway. And they've just released a startling, prophetic 2023 interview just a few months ago, May or June or something like that, with John Pilger. Rest in peace. You got to check this out. I mean, stick around for that, because it really is something else. But we got to begin where we got to begin, folks. And I hope people have some, comments and things for us on both topics. But, this is a tough one. And it has to do, of course, with this horrible situation in Perry, Iowa. Now, I had a clip here that I was going to bring up. I don't see it right away here to start with. We had to kind of run and gun to get this thing together. But it has to do with the reporting here. And I had this NBC report. Let me see if I can find it. And if I can, I will bring that up on screen here. Okay, so let's start here.
Back, a haunting bane of the past as another school shooting left a community grappling with sorrow and unspeakable loss. Authorities in the small town of Perry, Iowa say a 17-year-old student armed with a shotgun and a small caliber handgun shot and killed a sixth grader and wounded 4 other students along with a school administrator. By the time police located the shooter, they say he was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It happened early this morning as classes at Perry High School were set to resume today following the holiday break. But thoughts of the new semester quickly turned to thoughts of survival. Students running from the sound of shots, barricading themselves in classrooms, waiting for the horror to end. NBC's Von Hilliard is there tonight with the latest.
Tonight, horror for students on the first day back from winter break. A sixth grader killed and 5 others wounded in a school shooting in Perry, Iowa.
Units, we've got an active shooter situation at Perry High School.
Authorities say the shooting started at approximately 7:37 this morning as students and faculty arrived on campus. Officers arrived within 7 minutes.
We've got reports of multiple subjects injured at this time.
They immediately made entry and witnessed students and faculty either sheltering in place or running from the school.
Law enforcement officials say among the injured, 4 students and 1 school administrator, all being treated at nearby hospitals. The shooter, identified as Dylan Butler, a junior at the high school. Police say he was killed by a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Butler was armed with a pump-action shotgun and a small caliber handgun. Officers located during the search of the school an improvised explosive device.
Friends say Butler was bullied. One friend says he messaged her minutes before the shooting.
He said that he was fine and he was okay, he was all good.
Freshman student Philip Gray believes his friend was shot.
I think he was like close to the school shooter, so I'm guessing he probably got hit and probably tried to run away.
Do you know how your friend is doing?
I'm praying that he's okay.
A devastating tragedy hitting this small, tight-knit community.
And Vaughn joins us in the Perry High School. Vaughn, what's the status of the investigation right now?
Lester, multiple law enforcement agencies are on the ground here in Iowa, including the FBI, investigating the potential motive of this shooter. Well, the students at this school of nearly 700.
Okay, so I'm going to jump out of that. We've talked about that a lot. They always, what else are you going to do, I guess? You could give them a pass on that. But the motive, And I think that one student perhaps got to it. The bullying situation. It's hard to believe that exists like it does still in Iowa schools. We're all up in arms at each other's throats about books that kids in schools probably don't even read. And yet we can't seem to do anything about the bullying, which I witnessed firsthand back when I was in school, for God's sake. We can't do anything about that. The cops in schools didn't appear to be able to do anything about it. I don't know, if it were me, I'd spend my money, time, and effort trying to do something to hire people to get them into these schools to observe, watch, and try to intercede with these bullying situations. Now, Joe Gordon has been on my show. People know that. He is with Brady United. He spent a better part of his adult life studying this issue, and he is an advocate. And right after this happened, he posted on Facebook. I'm going to bring this up on screen here, folks. This was from Joe. He said, just a matter of time. Next steps. Number one, the media breathlessly reports about the shooter, victims, student reactions, funerals, etc. Now, this was before the reporting that you just saw. Stirs up emotions, sells advertising. Democrats cry out about the need for stronger gun laws before returning to their state of passivity. Republicans cry crocodile tears about mental health problems and the need to arm teachers. The public at large, and Joe says, this means you, shakes its head, shrugs its shoulders, and moves on. And that means we're waiting for the next one. Now, it's here in the Heartland. It's in Iowa, nice state. Nobody is used to these types of situations, but we're kind of maybe 4 degrees of separation state. Everybody knows somebody. This is from a friend of mine. This is from a hockey buddy of mine. He writes on Facebook, my wife teaches there, saw part of it, and the kiddo who died was one of her favorites. And if you can imagine, and I promoted this show by talking about the murder, the mayhem, and the mental scars of the survivors. If you can think about how teachers feel about these kids, and don't kid yourself, they really care. They really like these kids to watch, to see something like this and its aftermath. These are scars that will go on. The number is exponential because of these school shootings. And we have got, my God, we have got to do something and get these legislators to act. Okay, remember what Joe Gordon said about Democrats and Republicans on this thing? Honest to God, I'm making this up. This is this morning out of the Iowa Capitol Dispatch. It reads, Democratic legislative leaders were meeting with reporters in a legislative forum at the state capitol as the first shooting reports were being released. Quote, I want to start by just extending condolences to those in Perry, Iowa. Senate Minority Leader Pan Yoakum, Democrat from Dubuque, said, I know that we are still waiting for more details on what happened there, but I think I can speak for all the Democrats and actually everybody in the state of Iowa that our hearts go out to the families on whatever has occurred there. Again, this was early on, but come on, do something. Neither Yoakum nor House Minority Leader Jennifer Converse, it would be another Democrat, they're the minority. Neither one commented directly on a gun policy in Iowa. Now, the Republican legislative majority in Iowa has steadily loosened gun restrictions and regulations over the past few years. Prevention of gun violence has always been on our agenda, and we will keep a very watchful eye on how things progress in Perry. Again, that's the closing quote there from Yoakum. So, okay, I just wanted to bring people up to date. I couldn't start a show. I couldn't do a news show without, bringing this up on screen. And I encourage everybody watching today, if you've got a comment, if you've got a question, even as we work through the interview here with Brad Wolf, bring it up. Let's talk about this because people need to stay engaged and enraged. That's what the great Joe Gordon would tell you. Don't turn and look the other way, and don't walk away from this issue that should be right at the top of the list. It ought to be the number one priority in the legislature. This is our future being killed in the public schools, for God's sake. All right, let's turn the page here. Let's bring up, and I hope you saw the promo that I had up earlier. This is what I was going to have. Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, a 2023 interview with the journalism hero, John Pilger. Rest in peace. And joining us on the Podcast by George live line today, Brad Wolf, Executive Director and founder of the Peace Action Network in Lancaster, PA, a former prosecutor, lawyer, and community college dean. And he heads the Merchants of War Crimes Tribunal, which is underway as we speak. And I want to thank him right off the top for taking time out to talk to us so that we can review this really prophetic interview with the great John Pilger. So let's click a button here and click one there and say good morning to our friend here, the great Brad Wolf. Hi, Brad.
Good morning, George. How you doing?
Doing great, pal. I mean, that's a sad and tragic beginning. Like I say, Iowans pride themselves in being Iowa nice, and but I mean, the wolf is at the door in a lot of different ways. It's in the classroom, and the war dogs, the war, I don't know what war pigs, whatever you want to call it, they're in the living room as well. And that's what the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal is all about. And this interview with John Pilger. So I'm going to bring this up on screen. Update us, if you would, just on the progress of the tribunal and where you're at right now.
Yeah, we're about 25% of the way through releasing the evidence of the tribunal. We're on Afghanistan right now. We interrupted the flow of video evidence coming out because of John's passing. We had done this interview. I'd done this interview with John last May. And when he passed over the weekend, we thought it was important to put this interview out earlier. So that went out on Tuesday, but next week we're going to return to the evidence in Afghanistan, talk about Urazgan, the closing bombing of Afghanistan, and then move on to Iraq and Yemen, lobbying, think tanks, revolving door, and eventually closing arguments will occur about March. And we will get a verdict from our panel of judges, and we will see where we go from there. But the response has been great. We get lots of emails in each week. The email list is now over 2,500 participants in this tribunal. Wow. And we had a little meetup session over the holidays right after Christmas on a Saturday where we thought we just wanted to have people stop in to say hello and share their feelings over the holidays about the state of the world. And almost 80 people tuned in, which really surprised us. And there was really some heartfelt sharing of thoughts and emotions here in the West, during Christmas and this time of abundance and safety, given the state of the rest of the world.
My God. And the state of the rest of the world is in the state that it is, partially, if not almost wholly, because of the Merchants of Death, these companies that are getting richer than the Pharaoh, providing these weapons of mass destruction. And that's what the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal is all about. Now, when you go to the homepage here that I have up on screen, folks, and it's merchantsofdeath.org, right? That's the URL.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Go to merchantsofdeath.org. You'll see the homepage here, and then I put a couple of arrows in here. I think that the first one is, it's easily, if you want to participate, I am, buy a t-shirt, give them some money, for God's sake, to help this thing along. You can be a big part of this. And then you can see this interview with the great John Pilger and talk about that connection and how that came about, Brad.
We were compiling a list of witnesses over the course of the last year, and we wanted to have lawyers, journalists, victims, analysts of war, individuals like that. And John Pilger was certainly first on the list. And I did not know John. My colleague, Kathy Kelly, knew him, shared the contact information for John. I sent him an email. Of course, he was living in Australia at the time. He goes back and forth at the time between England and Australia. He responded quickly, said he'd love to be a part of this Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. We set up a time to talk. And last May, I talked to him over Zoom while he was in Australia. And we had this wonderful conversation. Here's this giant of journalism talking to me in such a kind and gracious and generous manner, being so insightful, so thoughtful, really taking his time with my questions and giving thoughtful answers. And at one point, this wasn't included in the interview we released, but at one point, our conversation veered off about my 25-year-old daughter who had tried to work in the corporate world and didn't like it, and so was working for nonprofits, and he was very interested in that. And so he started asking me questions. So I thought that was a real insight into the humanity of the man, that, he's genuinely interested in people. He was a very kind and wonderful person.
Yeah, that comes out during the interview. I'm going to bring that up. And for people that maybe need a little refresher on John Pilger, and you almost can't overstate the significance of this man and what his life work was. Let me bring a couple of articles here up on stage very quickly. This is from the BBC. Now, interestingly enough, and this is kind of the way that we are, everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of mainstream media had a lot of glowing things to say about John Pilger after he passed. But a lot of times they were not in his camp. They were not friends of his, particularly in his home country of Australia. But this is from the BBC. John lived in the UK. I mean, that's where he made his home. It says, John Pilger, campaigning Australian journalist dies. Well, again, look at every word. What does that mean, campaigning? Does that mean he was an advocate? Okay. But he was a journalist, folks. He was a truth teller. Is really what he was, best known for his work as a foreign correspondent, including reporting on the Vietnam War. He goes way back, John Pilger does. He was an old man. Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and from the United States during the turmoil of the 60s and 70s. I highlighted this. I was unaware of this, Brad. He was in the same room when Robert Kennedy was assassinated while running to be the Democratic nominee for the 1968 presidential election, according to his website. That would be in that hotel, in that kitchen in Los Angeles, way back then. I was really surprised to find that out. But again, it kind of speaks to the bona fides of this guy.
Absolutely. Somebody like that is putting themselves on the line, and they end up being, so to speak, in the right place at the right time. But they're also at these great historical moments, these inflection points of history. So he starts out covering Vietnam as early as 1962. As you said, he covers Cambodia, Indonesia, East Timor. And he's from Australia, and he had a particular interest in the way the indigenous Australians were treated by his country. And he released a number of documentaries on that, was relentless about that fact. Made over 50 films, wrote dozens of books, and was the youngest person to be awarded British Journalist of the Year in the 60s. He was really a insightful, relentless voice for the oppressed, for the victims. And I think that's what put him on the bad side of corporate journalism as we got into the 80s. And, you had corporate journalism really beginning to flourish.
I remember it well. See what else we've got here. In a 1990 interview on BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Discs, he said he'd always been interested in the victims of war, the people running the other way. And Brad and I have talked about that. The Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. We're talking about the corporate interests and all the money a lot of times. But Brad's the first one to point out we're talking about people being killed, millions of them because of this. Journalism is nothing if it's not about humanity, said John. It has to be about people's lives, he said. My God, how well said could that be? In recent years, he was a high-profile supporter of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is currently in Belmarsh prison, fighting extradition to the U.S. on charges related to the publication of thousands of classified documents in 2010 and 2011. He has described Assange as a truth teller who has committed no crime, but revealed government crimes and lies on a vast scale. Okay, now that's from the BBC. I want to bring this up because this is from the Australian Independent, or the Independent Australian, and just about any publication with independent in its title is going to get a second look from me. This is really well written, and you might even compare and contrast how they report on Pilger's passing according to, differently from the BBC that I just read through. It says the loss of a true Australian legend, John Pilger, dies. Pilger, a brilliant, bold, and prolific storyteller. He did a lot of storytelling in a lot of decades, wrote countless articles, authored 15 books, made 63 films, as Brad mentioned. He wrote and filmed the underrated and often uncomfortable truth as he saw it, a rare trait by today's journalism standards, and one for which he was not thanked by Australia's mainstream media. His career spans 7 decades, first coming to prominence as a war correspondent in Vietnam. That puts you to the head of the class as far as I'm concerned. And these war correspondents, a lot of them are kind of like war veterans. They come back and, they're not giving you the jingoistic John Wayne version of war. I mean, they've seen it firsthand. And so I pay a lot of attention to what people like John Pilger reported. He championed causes such as the horrors of the thalidomide drug. I remember that now, which eventually led to a special settlement for overlooked victims. Pilger exposed racism, human rights atrocities, and injustices the world over, including in East Timor and Cambodia, where Brad mentioned, where his documentary film, Year Zero, The Silent Death of Cambodia, raised, wasn't aware of this, it raised over $50 million for the survivors of the Pol Pot regime. And of course, Pol Pot, I don't know, a lot of people say, Hitler was operating with kid gloves almost compared to this Pol Pot guy. I remember him as well. John sent us articles whenever he could, writes the Independent Australia. With his piece, We Are Spartacus, his last article to be published in Independent Australia on 12 November 2023. Now, that was the last one with them. He may have published something different, but I wanted to read this, Brad, because this is really cool. This is a good example of this, the wordsmithing, and this guy, the way that he writes and what he writes about. He says, the grotesque injustice meted out to David McBride. Well, who's David McBride? Well, he's one of these whistleblowers. I mean, he's akin to a Chelsea Manning or something in Australia. Is minted from the injustice consuming his compatriot, Julian Assange. Both are friends of mine. Whenever I see them, I am optimistic. You cheer me, I tell Julian as he raises a defiant fist at the end of our visiting period. You make me feel proud, I tell David, at our favorite coffee shop in Sydney. He writes, Spartacus was the rebellious leader of Rome's slaves in 71-73 BC. There is a thrilling moment. Remember this? Anybody from our generation? We do. Brad and I remember this. Kirk Douglas, when the Romans call on Spartacus's men to identify their leader and so be pardoned, because they want Spartacus, Instead, hundreds of his comrades stand and raise their fists in solidarity and shout, I am Spartacus. The rebellion is underway, writes John. Julian and David are Spartacus. The Palestinians are Spartacus. People who fill the streets with flags and principle and solidarity are Spartacus. We are all Spartacus if we want to be. And the Independent Australia closed the article by saying, brilliant to the last, our democracy is poorer for his passing. I don't know. Maybe they got democracy in Australia. That's one thing. When you're using the word democracy these days, you got to be careful, because it ain't what it used to be, and it may not be at all in this country. But I don't know about Australia. Wale John Pilger. Wale, I think I've got that pronounced right, because that's Latin, folks, and my Latin isn't very good, but that has to do with the passing and farewell to John Pilger. Brad?
Yeah, it's like presente John Pilger, a life well lived. If you're going to teach your children about what is a life well lived, you can look to someone like John Pilger and say, a man who spoke the truth consistently over the decades, who incurred a lot of ridicule and had his career damaged because he continued to speak the truth, but nevertheless was relentless at doing so. That is a life well lived. That is courage. That's bravery. That's what we want our children to do, to stand up in that way, regardless of the outcome. Speak for the victims. And I've been told with a lot of my education, particularly at the Catholic Worker House, that if you're on the side of the victims, you're always going to be on the right side. So if you can continue to do that, you're going to lead a good life. And John's life is a perfect example of that. I love the Spartacus article. I think that's great. I think it's interesting that it is up to the citizenry to lead the media. Typically, we rely on the media to tell us and to take the lead and to write the lead and to write the narrative. But these days, in particular, for instance, in Gaza, it's the population, the citizenry who are taking to the streets and forcing the media to write the stories that we want written. So in my interview with John, he was wonderful. He starts right off, and maybe you'll show up with this idea that propaganda is silence too. When you're silent on certain matters, that is propaganda, just as bad as giving the wrong narrative.
Yeah, that's actually the most of what I pulled was his talk about propaganda, because that's what we talk about on this show all the time.
Yeah.
And I had this comment up from Desert Manus. Let me see if I can find this again. Let's see here. Yeah. So this is great. It's kind of a segue right into what we're going to. John's documentary films are testaments to humanity, and he says his humanity. Okay, well that takes us right to the opening clip here that I want to show from your interview with John, and it was kind of like, this is interesting to me because you ask him about his work and what about him. Now, watch this, folks. Watch this man's humanity, because you can tell almost he ain't interested in talking about that. He's interested in talking about these much bigger issues that affect us all. This guy's not a back slapper. I mean, he's not reaching around to slap his own back, even though he could. I mean, he could talk about me during this thing. He's talking about everybody else. And here's the opening clip I want to show. So watch this, folks. We'll come right back.
My interest over many years has to do with witnessing as a reporter a number of wars. And those wars have been fought with weapons that have been traded on an international market, no matter if they're coming direct from governments or not. But the other great weapon, of course, is propaganda. And I believe that's the most lethal weapon. And without propaganda, even the propaganda of silence, most propaganda comes from us not knowing, a kind of censorship by omission, leaving it out. Most news is dominated by this form of censorship, this form of propaganda. You don't know because they don't tell you.
And I love that British Australian, that accent of John's, obviously. But also, I'll tell people this: when you hear folks talk, like if you hear me talk on the air, for instance, I'm a broadcaster. I mean, a lot of times you talk first and think later, and you can tell with some of these broadcasters. But John Pilger is a print journalist, award-winning, and he's done these documentaries and Emmy. But when he speaks, I think the guy's composing thoughts in his head. It's a little bit more deliberate, but every word means something. And again, we're going to be talking about what a almost prophecy in this interview, what this man is talking about, Brad.
It was such a joy to interview him because, as you pointed out, that segment that you showed right there, that was prompted by my question to him. John, could you provide the tribunal with some of your background and your professional life? And he chose not to do that. He chose to go right into the heart of the matter. He's not interested in talking about himself, as you said. He's interested in talking about the main issue that he's dedicated his life to, and that is propaganda and how that is the most lethal weapon used in warfare today. We don't know what we don't know, right? And so when there's silence on an issue such as the Palestinians, we buy into this Israeli war narrative. When there's silence on issues of Ukraine, same thing. It's interesting that one of his first films that really had a big impact was on the poor morale of American soldiers in Vietnam. And when he filmed that and he took it back to America and showed it to Dan Rather, Dan said, "That's wonderful, but it'll never be shown here. It's not going to get out. There's no way that's going to get out." So
you can't understate the significance of that about everything. I got a little saying that as long as you glorify warriors, you'll always have war. And that's what we do in this country. Mm-hmm. And they won't have it any other way. And the other thing I think about in this John Pilger thing, with him not wanting to talk about himself, I'm a hockey guy. Brad knows that. There's a saying in hockey, if you talk a big game in the locker room, you probably suck. And John Pilger did not spend his life in the locker room, and he did not suck, and he had some things to talk about. And man, did he bring it in this interview. Now, I want, again, as we go through this, remind everybody, go to the merchantsofdeath.org, Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, and click on the link that'll take you to Rumble, where you can watch this entire interview with John Pilger. And again, he gets right to it here, talking about big bucks in forever wars my lifetime, maybe before. My God, watch this.
While there is a war going on, and one or two on the boil, and another one on the horizon, then you have what they call these days, bizarrely, forever wars. Then you will have a perpetual arms trade, making enormous profits. The kind of arms trade where profits are protected often from scrutiny. Much of the profit making in the development of nuclear weapons in the United States is protected from scrutiny by law.
Yeah. Okay. So again, that's another clip with John Pilger. Let me get Brad back in here. And I was not aware of this. Again, this is a great learning experience. We're looking at this. And this is something that he's reported on, obviously. But this nuclear stuff, even the money that's being spent on it, it's prohibited by law from being reported.
Yeah. State security interests, right? That's a great way to cover up the tracks of where all of our national wealth is going. And it is our national wealth that's being used. So when he talks about this international arms trade, he was also indicting the United Kingdom because they are huge in the international arms trade, the country in which he lived for so long. But in the United States, there are a series of laws that prevent us from ever knowing exactly how much is being spent on weapons. Congress just recently passed the new Pentagon budget, $886 billion, 4% higher than last year, the highest budget ever passed by any president in American history. That's going to weapons manufacturers. They're raking in profits. So they must have perpetual war. They need to have a Cold War against Russia, against China, in order to constantly gin up this fever among the American population and among Congress to pay for these weapons. So, when you expose that kind of information, you're going to be placed outside mainstream narrative, particularly corporate media, the way John was. But you've got to continue to speak that truth and try to get it out in any way you can.
He did. And talking about this propaganda, and I talk about it on my show all the time. It's very subtle a lot of ways, particularly from the mainstream media. And it has to do with watching every word that you're told. And Pilger was a wordsmith, a lifelong journalist. I mean, he thought about this. This is the way that he wrote. This is what his documentaries were about. And they were Emmy Award winning. I mean, this guy was big time stuff, folks. Make no mistake about it. Let me bring this up on stage here because I pulled this. Now, this is from the Wall Street Journal just the past couple of days. And think about how, if you see a life of this, if you're reading this kind of stuff for a lifetime, which most people are, I hate to say it, folks, but most are not watching podcasts by George. Most are not reading John Pilger. They're reading this stuff. This is from the Wall Street Journal. The West badly needs more missiles, but the wait to buy them is years long. Dang it. Global conflicts and rising threats drive orders for missiles, planes, submarines, and other complex weapon systems. But producers are struggling to supply chains and staffing. It's like you're talking about, the local coffee shop or burger place. The Ukraine war has highlighted the West's deficiencies. Remember what Brad just said? We're deficient, folks. We ain't got enough. We can't make enough in quickly producing more weapons at a time of need. Again, think about these phrases and these words. You just read that, you just go by that, but you come away with this almost subliminal thinking that, God, these things are needed. Well, we need more of them. Highlighting the Gaza conflict. Now, I've heard it likened more accurately to genocide in a concentration camp. I've heard a lot of people call it war. It ain't no war. I mean, it's a conflict. May tighten supplies for certain armaments. The constraint is particularly acute for missiles and the systems that defend against them. Okay, I don't. Brad, you can jump in here anytime.
Sure.
Yeah, these missiles, they create a need for weaponry that defends against them. Man, that's pretty good if you're a merchant of death.
Sure is. You got it both ways.
Yeah.
That's perfect. And there's no shortage of weapons in this country. There's a shortage of diplomacy. What we're doing is we're sending massive, massive amounts of weapons to other countries like Israel and Ukraine. And we're spending massive amount and supplying weapons to surround China. So it's not a shortage of weapons. It's a shortage of diplomacy. It's a shortage of effort on our part to try to install some kind of lasting peace in the world. When you're spending close to $1 trillion a year on weapons, more than the next 12 countries combined, more than all the world, other countries, it's not that we're not producing enough. Some of these people, like Anthony Blinken, who recently said that making all these weapons and sending them to Ukraine and Israel is good for the American economy because it creates jobs. What a cold, callous calculation of human life. Does he stop and think for a minute that on the receiving end of every bomb and bullet built is a human life?
Yes.
Hopefully a woman or a child.
Yes.
It's about jobs. It's about money, really. That's the calculus that our chief diplomat, the Secretary of State Blinken, uses when he speaks to the public.
Yeah.
So we lose all moral authority in the world when we talk like that. And speaking of moral authority, trying to overlook what Israel is doing in Gaza and then turn around and say that Putin is a war criminal because what he's doing in Ukraine is the height of hypocrisy. People know that. People across the globe know that. And the United States, with whatever moral authority it may have had left, loses it with that kind of action. So, when you perpetuate violence, and this goes to what you were talking about in your opening segment at Perry with the school shootings, and John alluded to this in my interview with him. With so many guns in America, there's a direct correlation between the violence that we, as America, commit abroad and facilitate abroad, and the violence that is committed here in the United States with school shootings and mass shootings and things like that. If you grow up in a family where violence is the response to frustration or anger, then you're going to use violence. And when Americans grow up in this family of America where violence is our choice, that is the first option out of our toolkit. That's what we use abroad all the time. When you see that all the time, then taking a gun into school to express your frustration becomes the common reaction. So I think it's like akin to Martin Luther King when he said, the bombs dropped in Vietnam explode in America. I think that still is happening today. The bombs dropped in Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, all over the world. As they're dropped, they're exploding in America with these school shootings and everything else today.
Yeah, let me put this comment up on screen. Boy, here's one that's near and dear to the heart of podcast by George Kelly says, is it any wonder kids don't value life when this is the message from our leadership? And I would put it this way also. And I've talked to Chris Hedges about this on my show about the role of Hollywood and television and mass media. If all of that stuff was built around using a knife for getting your way and movies and stuff, we'd have mass knifings. It's mass stabbing, something. If it was ball bats, we would have mass ball batting going on around this country. That's the situation with these guns. And I wanted to, again, bring this up on stage here for people to look at. And so that when you look at these articles, now, let me bring this up full screen. Check this out. This is about these missiles, and this goes to what Brad's talking about. See what they're showing here? You couldn't have anything more antiseptic, anything more non-threatening than this guy, these people, guys loading a missile up. But you could just as well, why not, show what these missiles do? But the mainstream media doesn't. We don't show the death and dismemberment and the horror of what we're talking about here. We show this type of photo, and they have the ability to show any photo they choose, Brad, and they choose a photo like that. Are they too dumb? Or are they in on it?
No, that is intentionally designed. The headline is designed to instill fear in Americans. We're unarmed. We're not ready. We're coming and we don't have enough. So that is designed to instill fear and get our acceptance to spend more. The picture, as you said, is an innocuous picture, right? It's guys loading a missile. You have no idea that when that missile hits a school or a building or a hospital, of the blown apart bodies at the end of that, and most likely they're innocents. 70% of the deaths in Gaza are women and children. So we could easily see pictures of that if they wanted to show what's on the receiving end of that, but they don't. And when you go to any of the 4 defendants on this tribunal that we're doing, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, or General Atomics, go to their websites And you're going to see pictures just like that. It's just of these really cool jets flying through the air and missiles shooting. It's nothing about the destruction. It's nothing about the death and the slaughter that was on the receiving end once those missiles explode.
Yeah, and when I go full screen here, when I do my introduction and stuff, I never know which way to go. This book you can see off my right shoulder. Chris Hedges. This is his book about war. He was a war correspondent. He's seen it firsthand. Read this, because this death and dismemberment that Brad's talking about, again, it's nothing like the war porn that you see in movies and on television and that type of thing. It's not even like Saving Private Ryan. A little bit that opening thing on Normandy is kind of like that. My God, the gore, the way, the method that these people are dying, and in Gaza, trapped under rubble for days. Those are your last moments of life, screaming in anguish and pain, in darkness, in fear. I mean, my God, we're doing that to one another by the millions, folks. That's what we're talking about here. And I wanted to continue with this article in the Wall Street Journal because it gets better. Let me see if I can get that up on screen here. While flush with higher defense budgets, the West hasn't faced the same supply constraints. Again, what are we talking about here? Since perhaps the Korean War, some military analysts say, 10 of the West's largest defense companies alone are currently sitting on order books worth $730 billion, up around 57% from the end of 2017, when demand started ramping up. And I bring that up because I have some Trumpies that watch my show or whatever. It started ramping up during the Trump administration because he was doing some things like walking away from the Iran nuclear deal. He was bombing Syria. I mean, this started in 2017. We have all have to increase our production. What? We do? Said Pentagon acquisition chief Bill LaPlante at a November conference. He held one hand high and the other low. Shit. And he said, the worldwide demand is here. The ability to supply is about here. God, Brad, what's your reaction to that?
I mean, I think of a drug addict, right? Like, yeah, the demand's here and supply's here, right? That's kind of a good thing, right? You don't want the supply to meet the demand on drugs, and weapons are drugs, for a lot of people. And I love who they quote here. The first paragraph quotes, quote, military analyst, and the second one is a Pentagon chief. Yes. So it's like asking, people on the same side to comment on what they're doing. I was watching the BBC last night, and there was a woman on, a strategic war policy analyst who's with the Center for a New American Century. Sounds innocuous, sounds great, a Center for a New American Century. Well, that Center for a New American Century is funded by weapons manufacturers. And she was talking about the need to increase weapons productions and be ready for this coming war with China and Russia, and said that if we allow Putin to do what he wants to do in Ukraine, he will attack all of NATO. He will attack 32 countries in NATO. It's the most ridiculous assertion you can believe, but not many people know that these, quote, think tanks are funded by weapons manufacturers. So, again, this is what we don't know. It's what's not reported. Good journalism has to have this sort of rolling thunder approach that I've read about, which the idea is that you continue to write and write and write more and more about the same story until it finally sinks in. That's something John would do. So, yeah, it's the propaganda of silence. John Pilger talks about that with Brad. That's what we're talking about here. I think it might be one of the most powerful and pervasive form, and particularly in our society, of propaganda that there is. And people that watch my show know I bitch about this all the time. I talked about Chris Hedges. The guy was a New York Times Middle East bureau chief. A war correspondent. He speaks Arabic. He's a ordained minister. Yeah. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He won a Pulitzer. Okay, why wouldn't you, in an article like this, as an example, or on your evening news, or on Meet the Press, or something like that, cite him? Why won't he get a seat at the table? Are they too dumb, or are they in on it? Let's hear what John has to say about the prophecy of propaganda. This is great.
And we have to start identifying our own propaganda. just as lethal as theirs. It causes wars. It's part of the media play a role in starting wars, in beating the drums of wars, or putting out the myths that are very little different from the kind of myths that were put out during the First World War. You know, German soldiers ate Belgian babies and that kind of thing. Well, similar myths have been put out about the Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Similar myths have been put out constantly by the Russians, about the Russians, sorry. Understanding this is very empowering, actually, I think.
That's great. Now I'm going to play this. The next one is really good because he talks specifically about the propaganda of silence that we've been talking about here. But I mean, well, he was right on it then. When I see that, Brad, I think about the 40 beheaded babies thing that started off the reporting on this and repeated by the president of the United States, for God's sake. That's what he's talking about here.
He is, you know, and he also mentions later in the interview, you know, the Soviet Union had obvious propaganda, right? But they were more open about the fact that it was propaganda. Like, you know, in the United States, we claim that we have this free and independent press, and they're really kind of reporting on what's actually going on, and most Americans are buying that. But the hypocrisy in that is what needs to be explored and examined and put out there for everybody to see. I do think it's starting to happen. I do think people are getting a little more skeptical of mainstream media, corporate America, and things like that. But you got to work hard to find the news, and a lot of people don't have the time to do that. So they're either going to tune out of news altogether and become complacent, which is just as good for the weapons manufacturers, the merchants of death, or they're going to just succumb to the 6:30 evening version of the news, which, you know, you can see the embedded reporters in with the Pentagon, in with different, you know, military advisors and things like that. You know what the narrative is going to be from that end. So it doesn't really do you much good. I had mentioned that famous quote from H.L. Mencken to John Pilger, which is the role of the media is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And yeah, we don't see that a whole lot on the press anymore. They're very chummy with State Department officials and Pentagon officials, and the relationship should be adversarial. You know, I was a prosecutor, and it was the adversarial system of justice by intention, by design, right? And that should also exist between the media and our government. Otherwise, there's no check on government.
We're the fourth estate. We're supposed to be that way. And, you know, Pilger, that has a lot to do with Assange, because you talk about the chilling effect on media. I tell people it's created frozen ground. They're frozen in place. I think they're afraid to start to do this in real terms like John Pilger did because of what will happen to him. Okay, that takes us right to the next clip. I want to, again, go to the merchantsofdeath.org to see this whole interview. But here's the propaganda of silence from John Pilger.
So the propaganda of silence, we don't know these things. Well, you know them and I know them. But people who don't have the time that we have, and I say the time, you're a specialist on it. I'm a specialist, I suppose, of a kind, being a journalist. But people who go about their lives don't know this. And that's why I think the propaganda and propaganda of silence is so very important. I mean, just take one thing I was reading about yesterday, and that is the perennial secret of Israel's nuclear weapons. Finally, we have that Mr. Barak, the former prime minister, has finally come out worried about the extreme nature of the Israeli government, and said that he's worried that this government is going to have in its hands, as he called it, this messianic government is going to have in its hands nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and we still aren't talking about that hardly at all. You don't hear that in the conversation about Gaza. with Israel and the nuts that are running that country now. According to the Israelis, a lot of people are really dissatisfied, unhappy with the way things are being run in their country. Those people have their fingers on the nuclear triggers, Brad. And again, guess who gave it to them?
Exactly. That their nuclear weapons program was funded, facilitated, engineered by the United States. And Israel's been described as the floating battleship of the United States in the Middle East, right? It's there to protect our oil, as if it's ours, but the oil that we want. And that's why we're doing all this for Israel, giving them nuclear weapons. We give them the largest fleet of fighter jets in the world, American-made fighter jets. And they do these kinds of things. That attack that we just saw in Beirut, Lebanon, where a senior member of Hamas was killed 2 days ago, Israel did not notify us in advance of that. They notified us while it was in progress. So we've kind of created this monster that no longer responds to us in the way we thought it would. They're going to act out however they want, and we've armed them to the teeth to enable them to do so. So that kind of discussion, you're not going to hear from Anthony Blinken, you're not going to hear from Joe Biden, and you're not going to hear in corporate media. There's not going to be any editorials about that written, because that flies in the face of what the mainstream narrative is. You've also got an extremely powerful Israeli lobbying group in the United States that is going to go after people who don't follow the narrative. They're going to be considered anti-Semitic, as if you can't be against Zionism but still not be anti-Semitic. So there are real problems here, and I think a closer examination, the way John does it, is the way to go. He was, a proponent of the tribunal. He was appreciative of that. It's a limited audience that we have up against the New York Times, the Washington Post, and things like that. But if you look at what's happened over the past couple of months since October, it is the people, the citizens of the world, that have changed policy in governments as it pertains to Gaza. When hundreds of thousands of people were hitting the streets over these last months, finally, these governments started to change, including the United States. The tone changed about Gaza. Now, it's not over or anything by a stretch, but the tone has clearly changed.
Yeah, let's talk about the merchants of death. John does in this interview. In this last clip, I want to play this again. Go and see the whole interview because this is great. And again, if you appreciate this, if you like this, give some money to the merchants of death and Brad Wolf for doing this outstanding interview and bringing this to the world. Here, John Pilger talks about what I call the 50-50 proposition with the merchants of death. Listen to the math here.
U.S. arms dominate the arms trade. They take up almost half. Some say 40%, but it's really half. And when you think that the Pentagon consumes more than half of the federal government's discretionary budget, I love that word, discretionary budget, but in fact, real budget that the Pentagon consumes more than half of it. That's more than 50 cents in every dollar heads down to the Pentagon. That is the beating heart of really the whole armaments business. Without the Pentagon demanding arms, demanding new kinds of arms, demanding new plutonium pits in Los Alamos, or as they call it, new generation bombers, then the arms trade would be small by comparison.
Hi, singing the song of the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. We're just about out of time. I hear him talk about next generation weapons. I got to tell you, because I saw the movie, I liked it. I think you maybe even mentioned it on a show, Brad. Top Gun, whatever the most recent, the Tom Cruise movie.
Maverick.
That whole thing was about going up against next generation fighters from some unknown country and how we were at such a disadvantage and how, that was the heroism of the movie, really, was our ability to fight back against these next generation. And again, propaganda from Hollywood. You would come away from that movie saying, boy, we got to get some of them.
Right.
I mean, we need some. Yeah.
That script was written by the Pentagon, right?
Yes.
There's the Pentagon has that department that works hand in glove with Hollywood, reviewing and writing scripts. And if the Pentagon doesn't approve the script, then you don't get to use the toys of the U.S. military for your movies. So that movie in particular was one that was done in close cooperation with the Pentagon. It was a recruiting film. Recruitment is down. That was designed to try to get, recruitment back up. There's a reason that people in the Pentagon don't want the Biden loan forgiveness program to work for college students, because they want them to have to go into the military to go to college. So, there's this incredible web that grabs our young people in universities, it grabs the corporations, the weapons manufacturers, and funnels it all into this military industrial complex. And when John Pilger's talking about next generation bombers, I hear that a lot, next generation submarines, missiles, bombers. And I think, well, what about the next generation of Americans? What happens to them? They don't have health care, they don't have housing, they're in debt from college, the job outlook is grim in terms of pay. My children, their generation in their 20s, will probably never be able to own a house the way things are going with the real estate market. So what about the next generation of Americans? Yet the Pentagon always sort of sits aside. Their budget is you can't touch their budget. I read today that with the negotiations going on with the budget, mandatory cuts may kick in everywhere except the defense budget. That was exempted. No mandatory cuts for the defense budget, but mandatory cuts for everything else. So, how did they get that position? How did that evolve where they are sort of untouched? And it's through weapons manufacturers, $1 billion in corporate donations and everything that we've been talking about. So.
Well, we're out of time here. We're coming out, top of the hour is upon us, and it always is. It comes quickly when we talk to Brad with these film clips. And of course, we started off talking about the situation in Perry. I'm bringing this up on screen. This is from Matt Grunwald, regular viewer of the show, great friend of Podcast by George. He says, nuclear war might be a reasonable solution to this ongoing madness. Now, he's got tongue firmly in cheek when he says that, Brad. But this goes to what you and I kind of close on and talk about all the time. It does not have to be this way. This ain't natural. If it were, you wouldn't need propaganda that we've been talking about. It makes you think like this. This is what the merchants of death want, and it's up to us to think differently and break free, Brad.
It really is. And when there's talk about tactical nuclear war and the ability to fight a tactical nuclear war, that's the Pentagon and the military industrial complex trying to drop those ideas, seed those ideas among the American people and the world that these kind of wars could be fought, and therefore we need these weapon systems. So they're seeding us. They're trying to get us into a position where we would accept something like that. But we need to live lives like John lived. We need to live lives that are well-intentioned, that they're lives of integrity and morality and strength. And if we do that, if enough of us do that, I think we can change the narrative. We can force it. We can take risks. And try to get something better to happen in this country and in this world of violence, whether it's school shootings in Perry, Iowa, or it's what's happening in Gaza. The violence has got to stop, or we are going to destroy each other.
And we've got just a minute to go here, so I'm gonna give you the closing remarks here. I'm gonna bring this up on screen once more. This is the homepage of the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. Again, tell us where we're at with the tribunal. Tell us how people can get involved. Give us a wrap up here, Brad.
Sure. People go to merchantsofdeath.org. They can sign up and they can get the evidence emailed to them. The evidence is in the form of usually 30-minute videos that we release each week on various areas of the globe that the Merchants of Death, the 4 weapons manufacturers that we are examining, have exploited. And it talks about how the weapons manufacturers work hand in glove with the Pentagon, with Congress, often with fossil fuel companies to go in, make military maneuvers, extract the resources for profits, all done at taxpayer expense. So we're going to continue this examination up until March. It's an in-depth examination. We've got lots of good evidence coming up. So all you need to do is sign up at merchantsofdeath.org.
Great. And thanks again for that outstanding interview for the ages, really, with John Pilger. Brad, as always, pal, thanks for coming on this podcast by George Liveline.
Thank you so much for having me and highlighting all this information. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to do it just in the memory of John Pilger. My God, what a journalist that man was. And again, go to merchantsofdeath.org to see the entire interview. It is well worth it. You will enjoy it and you will learn a lot of things. Now, a shameless plug for me, always at the end of my show. If you like what you've seen here, go go to podcastbygeorge.com and subscribe on YouTube and Facebook easily on my website. Don't try to do it on the platforms. That's difficult. Do it the easy way. Go to podcastbygeorge.com. And you can also sign up for the audio-only versions of the show that appear on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, and places like that. But that's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.